Willkommen zurück auf Neutrality Studies.
Welcome back to Neutrality Studies, and today I once again have General Harald Kujat with me. Mr. Kujat was the highest-ranking officer in the Bundeswehr in the early 2000s and chairman of the NATO Military Committee. Mr. Kujat, welcome back.
Willkommen zurück.
Gladly, yes.
Herr Kujat, Sie haben vor kurzem in den
Mr. Kujat, you recently published an article in the media about ideas or possibilities for peace with Russia. Could you briefly explain how, as a realist in European politics, you currently view the prospects for peace?
Im Moment auf Friedensmöglichkeiten blickt?
Well,
Well, I have to remind you that we were the group. It wasn't just me alone, it was a group, including, among others, Peter Brandt, Willy Brandt's eldest son, then Michael von der Schulenburg, a former senior UN official, and of course Horst Teltschik, formerly Helmut Kohl's security policy advisor, whom I know very well from our time together in the Federal Chancellery. This group had already published a proposal once before, namely at the end of August 2023. But the situation was different back then. In the meantime, of course, developments have continued, and in particular, the military situation has changed dramatically.
Die militärische Lage hat sich dramatisch verändert. Insofern waren die damaligen Vorschläge nicht mehr auf.
In that respect, the proposals from back then could no longer be maintained. However, for several weeks now, we have practically had a standstill. The American president very early on published a proposal, 28 points. As a basis, it must be said, not as the result of peace negotiations, but as a foundation for the start of peace negotiations. The European allies have tried to exert their influence on it. Changes have been made, and adjustments have also been incorporated in coordination with the Ukrainian and Russian governments.
Eingearbeitet worden. Wie der letzte Vorschlag, der aktuelle tatsächlich
What the final proposal, meaning the current one, actually looks like is not known. We only know the various versions that existed in between, and we know that according to Ukraine in particular, Zelensky speaks of about 10%. These issues have not yet been resolved. Of course, one has to say that these questions cannot really be resolved in advance. This is not about a negotiated outcome, but about creating a basis that both sides could agree on as a prerequisite for peace talks to begin.
Als Voraussetzung, dass Friedensverhandlungen beginnen. Und so sehen wir auch unseren Vorschlag.
And that's how we see our proposal as well. We have tried to resolve, as we see it, the still open and particularly difficult questions. But first, it must be said, it is now especially important to do something for the future of Ukraine. The killing must, just as Trump has repeatedly said, come to an end. Ukraine must be able to exist as an independent, neutral, and secure state, as a sovereign state. And this goal is increasingly at risk the longer this war drags on militarily, with the danger that there will be no negotiations at all, but that this war will be decided on the battlefield. In that case, there would no longer be any basis for negotiations.
Dann braucht man auch keine Grundlage mehr für Verhandlungen. Ist die Ausgangssituation für uns gewesen.
That was our starting point. Then we identified the various difficult aspects. First, there's the territorial question. That is there a solution to Russia's demand to turn a region in eastern Ukraine, and we still have to discuss which region exactly, into Russian territory, and would Ukraine be willing to allow that? Then there's the question of NATO membership, which keeps coming up, has played a role from the very beginning, and has always essentially been a no-go for Russia. That has to be said very clearly. And the third question concerns the size of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Der ukrainischen Streitkräfte, wie groß dürfen diese Streitkräfte aus russischer
How large can these armed forces be from the Russian point of view, and how large must they be from the Ukrainian point of view? And the final point is the question of security guarantees after a peace treaty or even after a ceasefire, meaning security guarantees for Ukraine. And on the European side in particular, in some European countries, there is an effort to make these security guarantees as strong as possible in order to prevent another Russian attack. That is the starting point, and we then elaborated on that.
Und dazu haben wir dann Ausführungen gemacht.
wie, wenn wir uns über die Sicherheitsgarantien unterhalten.
When we talk about security guarantees, I don't quite understand this debate. It's said that security guarantees are needed so that Russia doesn't attack again. But the fact is, there's already a war going on. So wouldn't the initial question be, what has to happen for Russia to be willing to lay down its arms? And you've already mentioned Ukraine's neutrality. So wouldn't a European agreement on a neutral Ukraine be a central part of what could serve as a starting point for talks with Russia? Because we have to remember, the Europeans still aren't negotiating with Russia. It's the Americans who are negotiating with Russia.
Immer noch nicht mit Russland, es sind die Amerikaner, die mit Russland verhandeln.
Ja, also zudem ist es so, es muss natürlich ein
Yes,
Ergebnis
well,
geben,
in the end, there has to be a result, a peace treaty, and possibly, or even preferably, on the way to that peace treaty already during the negotiations. So if a certain level of trust has been established, if mutually accepted rules for a ceasefire have been worked out by both sides, then there could also be a ceasefire as an interim step. But in the end, there must be a peace treaty, and it's important to keep in mind that this peace treaty has to be signed by both Russia and Ukraine.
Von Russland und von der Ukraine unterschrieben werden muss. Das ist ein bilateraler Vertrag. Dazu kann es
This is a bilateral treaty. There can be side agreements, supplementary agreements, or accompanying agreements. That's all possible. But the core remains a peace treaty between Ukraine and Russia. And that's why it's important to take into account the interests of both Russia and Ukraine. Of course, this treaty must also be acceptable to the Europeans and the United States. I'll repeat once more. The core is the agreement between the warring parties. That's the crucial point. And naturally, these treaties must also include rules to prevent the resumption of fighting. That means these rules must be compatible with the interests of both warring parties.
Mit den Interessen der beiden Kriegsparteien kompatibel sein. Das ist ein ganz wichtiger Aspekt. Und es kommt ein weiteres hinzu.
That's a very important point. And there's something else to add. No war begins out of nowhere, so to speak. Every war arises from a political situation and leads to a new political situation. The crucial thing is to eliminate the causes within that initial political situation that were decisive for the outbreak of the war. Otherwise, if you bypass or ignore them, they naturally persist, take on a life of their own, and at some point, another war will inevitably break out. And that, of course, must be avoided. Now, the security guarantees for Ukraine play a very essential role in this.
Auch die Sicherheitsgarantien für die Ukraine eine ganz wesentliche Rolle. In diesen Sicherheitsgarantien muss auch Vorsorge.
These security guarantees must also ensure that the causes of the war do not continue to exist or even intensify in the future. There was already a draft treaty between Russia and Ukraine, the Assistance Treaty on Ukraine's permanent neutrality and security guarantees for Ukraine. So, those provisions were already included. This treaty is dated April 15, 2022, just a few weeks after the war began. These are the so-called Istanbul negotiations. The treaty named 5 guarantor powers, namely the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, including Russia.
Also auch Russland. Dieser Punkt war bis zum Ende eigentlich.
This point was actually disputed until the very end, and for a very simple reason. Ukraine insisted that each of these guarantor states should act independently of all others in the event of an attack and take its own measures to defend Ukraine. Russia, on the other hand, had previously demanded a vote among the guarantor powers, a kind of coordination, so to speak. Ukraine saw this as a way to impose a veto, meaning to block assistance. However, this issue was supposed to be discussed later between the presidents. Of course, that never happened because Ukraine did not continue the negotiations.
Weil die Ukraine die Verhandlungen nicht fortgesetzt hat. Man muss also jetzt eine Regelung finden, die
So now, a regulation must be found that prevents such a situation. And there is the Coalition of the Willing, which has declared its readiness to do so. The core states are France, the United Kingdom, and Germany, but there are also other European countries that must take part in these security guarantees. What's crucial is that the guarantor states are designated by Ukraine, and those designated states must be accepted by Russia. So this is a very difficult issue that needs to be overcome.
Schwieriger Punkt, den man überwinden muss.
Warum? Was ich nicht ganz verstehe,
What I
warum
don't quite
überhaupt
understand is this.
Sicherheitsgarantien
Why
gab.
security
Wenn wir
guarantees at all?
gesehen haben, die acht
In 1815,
Grundrechte
the 8 great
des,
powers of the Congress of
Wiener
Vienna
Kongress
wrote Swiss neutrality into the
Schweizerneutralität,
treaties, and no one gave any
Regeln
guarantees.
geschrieben und keiner hat
It was
Garantien
actually the
gegeben.
other way around.
Man hat gesagt,
They said,
Schweiz, du
Switzerland,
musst
you must
alles
guarantee the
absichern,
security of the
übrigens
Alpine
sollten
passes.
immer,
And by the way,
Savoy
if anyone tries to take Upper Savoy, you have to stop them. But the idea of a neutral Ukraine would be that a neutral Ukraine itself becomes a buffer zone, a kind of protective mechanism for Russia, meaning that the neutrality and territorial integrity of the buffer state would be in Russia's interest. So if that scenario were to happen, where would security guarantees even be needed? Because on the other side, Ukraine would also be a buffer state for the Europeans. So it would be in everyone's interest that no one enters there.
In allen Interesse, dass niemand dort eintritt.
Ja, Sie haben das Beispiel des Wiener Kongresses genannt.
Yes, you mentioned the example of the Congress of Vienna. You could also mention the example of Austria. It was a similar situation there. Back then, Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, insisted on permanent neutrality in 1954. And this neutrality has neither been in danger so far, nor has Russia, so to speak, ever disregarded this guarantee of neutrality. That's something we should always keep in mind. And you quite rightly used the term buffer zone. That's a crucial point.
Pufferzone, genau. Das ist ein ganz entscheidender Punkt. Dieses strategische Ziel hat Russland
Russia has pursued this strategic goal since the mid-1990s, creating a buffer zone, particularly in the area where the former Warsaw Pact states and the 3 former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, were located. Why did Russia pursue this goal? Because it wanted to prevent a situation in which NATO soldiers and Russian soldiers would face each other directly, where a technical or human error could lead to an escalation that could no longer be contained politically. That's why this distance was sought.
Deshalb dieser Abstand und gleichzeitig
At the same time, the Russians argued back then that in this zone, in this cordon sanitaire, as I'll call it, crises and conflicts could arise that would affect the security interests of both Russia and NATO, and that both sides must therefore be able to prevent the outbreak of a war between NATO and Russia, that could result from such crises and conflicts. In other words, to put it a bit more bluntly, to stamp out a smoldering fire before it turns into a wildfire. That was also the reason why the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act included a clause that essentially established a mechanism for how the two sides would communicate in such cases and what options they would have to reach a joint arrangement.
Man hat, eine gemeinsame Regelung zu finden, und das ist nach wie vor
And that, from my point of view, has remained a crucial factor in the relationship between NATO and Russia. It ultimately led to a period of close political coordination within the NATO-Russia Council, but also to very close cooperation on the military side. The major mistake NATO made here was that it failed to adequately uphold an arrangement designed to preserve peace and prevent war, an arrangement created during a time of close cooperation in what was almost a friendly relationship, since back then, Russia was a strategic partner of NATO. That is often forgotten, a strategic partner.
Das wird häufig vergessen. Ein strategischer Partner. Das ist also eine Regelung.
So this is a regulation that was created during a period of close cooperation, but then when it was actually needed, namely from 2008 onward, it was suspended. In my view, that was a very serious mistake. Because the crucial point, as anyone familiar with crisis management or conflict prevention knows, is precisely during the early stages of a potential conflict that communication is essential. You need to understand what the other side wants, and you need to understand what the other side is capable of. That doesn't mean you have to accept it, but it allows you to adjust your own response more effectively in order to, just as in this case, solve the problem together. Unfortunately, that simply wasn't done.
Dieses Problem zu lösen. Leider ist das nicht gemacht worden.
Yes, they set up a hotline, and then, when it was actually needed, they just threw it away.
It's really tragic, but the Russian representation at NATO, there used to be a military mission at NATO. I myself was chairman of the NATO-Russia Council of Chiefs of Defense, and we held regular meetings. Every 2 weeks, and at least twice a year, usually much more often, the NATO chiefs and the Russian chief of the general staff sat together at the table and solved common problems. So much of that is forgotten. There were even Russian soldiers who served under NATO command. They were assigned to NATO during the Kosovo mission. And that cooperation was excellent. There's really no other way to describe it. The Russians were very interested in taking part in that operation.
An dieser Operation teilzunehmen. Warum? Natürlich, weil im Osten des Landes.
Why? Naturally, because in the eastern part of the country, there is still a very large proportion of Serbian citizens. Originally Serbian citizens, that is. I myself negotiated the agreement with Russia back then. That was a very, very important step in military cooperation. But we also did a lot together with Russia in areas where Russian interests were involved. For example, after the sinking of the Kursk, we carried out joint exercises for rescuing submarine crews at great depths and similar things. I'm just mentioning these 2 examples. There was much more that we did at the time, and it had a very positive impact.
Damals getan haben und was sich sehr positiv ausgewirkt hat. Im Übrigen will ich in diesem Zusammenhang auch daran erinnern.
Moreover, I would like to remind you in this context that the end of the war in Ukraine is of extraordinary importance for Europe in 2 respects. The risk that the war in Ukraine could turn into a war over Ukraine remains very high, and it has in fact grown repeatedly in recent times. That is one aspect of particular importance for Europeans. The other is this: the prerequisite for achieving a lasting, reliable arrangement, one that becomes part of a security and peace order for Europe as a whole, including both Ukraine and Russia, naturally depends on this war coming to an end. It is, so to speak, the cork on the bottle.
Ist sozusagen der Korken auf der Flasche. Wenn wir den rausziehen, dann können wir uns auch an diese Arbeit machen.
If we pull that out, then we can also get to work on what we failed to do in 1990, meaning how we didn't implement the Charter of Paris or take up other proposals that came from the Russian side in the meantime, and make up for it. And from our point of view, as we also wrote in our proposal, we could then not only conclude an agreement, but also formally and legally establish this pan-European Union, this security and peace order among the participating states. That would actually be the solution we need, and that would include a whole range of other things: disarmament treaties, arms control agreements, military measures for stability and confidence building, and much more. So I've been talking for quite a while now.
So, jetzt habe ich aber lange geredet.
Ja, aber es sind alles sehr, sehr wichtige Punkte und man muss einfach
Yes, but those are all very, very important points. And one also has to say, the one European power that has been saying for years that we need a pan-European security arrangement is, after all, the Russians. And they're still saying it now, that a pan-European arrangement is needed. Of course, by that they don't mean the Europeans should get everything they want, and we have to hand Putin over to The Hague, but rather that we need an agreement on how to ensure together that no bombs are dropped and no missiles are flying back and forth. How do you see the role of the Americans, especially now that the Americans and the Europeans apparently are opening a new chapter, since they now seem to want a piece of Europe, namely Greenland?
Indem sie jetzt ein Stück Europa wollen, und zwar Grönland.
Ich will einen Satz noch zu dem Punkt, den Sie gemacht haben.
I want to add one more sentence about the point you made. It is indeed the case that the then Russian President Medvedev made a very concrete proposal in 2008, linking this treaty arrangement to both the Helsinki, that is, the CSCE Treaty, and the Charter of Paris. We also refer to this in our proposal. That doesn't mean it has to happen in exactly the same way, but it serves as a kind of reference point for everyone on how it could be done. As for the question of American participation in this peace arrangement, we are currently in an extremely difficult situation in the relationship between Europe and the United States. And of course, that is connected to various issues.
Und das hängt zusammen natürlich mit verschiedenen Punkten. Wir haben in der Vergangenheit sehr oft
In the past, we have very often simply accepted whatever was demanded by the United States. For example, during President Trump's first term, we accepted that the INF Treaty on Euro-strategic nuclear weapons, so immensely important for Europe's security, was unilaterally terminated by the United States. We should not have done that. And then the federal government rather casually stated that the termination had been unavoidable. No, it was not unavoidable at all. The accusations the United States made against Russia at the time could have been verified by simply reactivating the INF Treaty's verification regime.
Des INF-Vertrages einfach reaktiviert hätte. Dann hätte man gewusst, ob es stimmt oder ob es nicht stimmt.
Then we would have known whether it was true or not. That was a huge mistake. And we made more mistakes. I'd just like to remind you that a German chancellor stood next to an American president when he said, "We will destroy your energy supply," and there was no reaction. Well, I would have at least expected him to say, "You must be aware that this is an energy supply that is of fundamental importance to our economy and our industry." No, things like that have happened again and again in the past.
Solche Dinge sind ja in der Vergangenheit immer wieder passiert. Und dann haben die Europäer den großen Fehler gemacht, dass sie
And then the Europeans made the big mistake of taking sides in this war, which is taking place between Russia and Ukraine, and has, from the very beginning, also been a proxy war between the United States and Russia, simply and exclusively on the side of Ukraine. That was certainly important. I don't want to downplay it. When a country in the middle of Europe is attacked, it must be possible to support that country in its defense. But it must not be a one-dimensional path. It has to be a dual approach. At the same time, there is an obligation to work for peace, not only for the Ukrainian government, but for the people in that country, to end the killing, to end the destruction of the country.
Das Töten zu beenden, die Zerstörung des Landes zu enden. Die Europäer haben 4 Jahre lang.
For 4 years, the Europeans neither had the strength nor the will to even begin such a peace settlement. And then the American president comes along and takes it on. And once again, the Europeans are, so to speak, the ones running after developments, still trying to save a few European interests. But the decisive factor is the United States. The decisive factor is President Trump. And I could name many other things. Just take the increase in defense spending to 5% of GDP. That was simply initiated by Trump.
Von Trump einfach so initiiert. Ob das wirklich
Whether that was really calculated the way we did it in 2004, when we demanded that defense spending be increased to 2% of the gross domestic product, isn't so clear. We've simply kept following Trump's approach. And now the situation is being pushed too far. Now the demand is that Greenland should either be sold to the United States or taken by military force, so to speak. And that's where the Europeans are making their next big mistake. It's not a question between the United States and the European Union. It's a question of security, as President Trump himself called it, for the United States. These are security policy interests, strategic interests.
Sicherheitspolitische Interessen der Vereinigten Staaten, strategische Interessen. Also es ist eine NATO-Angelegenheit. Warum hat es denn
So, it's a NATO matter. Why hasn't there been a NATO summit on Greenland yet? That's the place where these things need to be discussed. And why is that the place? Remember, there's a treaty between Denmark and the United States from 1951, a defense treaty, a defense agreement, that precisely defines the cooperation and the rights of the United States. This agreement was updated again in 2004, and it again refers to the connection with NATO. So it really is a NATO issue that needs to be discussed here. And let me add one more thing. This isn't just about the security of the United States.
Nicht nur die Sicherheit der Vereinigten Staaten. Wenn es Probleme mit der Sicherheit der Grönlands gibt,
If there are problems with Greenland's security, then those are also problems that concern Europeans. There must not be zones of differing security within NATO, but rather the security of every single ally. The security of Germany or Luxembourg is just as important as the security of the United States. That's where it belongs. There were also chancellors who saw it the same way. I would just like to remind you of Helmut Schmidt, who in January 1979, when the United States and Russia were negotiating intercontinental strategic systems and completely ignoring the Soviet Union's nuclear Euro-strategic buildup, told then U.S. President Jimmy Carter, "We do not accept zones of differing security."
Wir akzeptieren keine Zonen unterschiedlicher Sicherheit. Diese Frage der Bedrohung durch
This issue of the threat posed by the Soviet Union's Euro-strategic nuclear systems must be addressed. And that's how the NATO double-track decision came about. So why don't we recall that approach? One last sentence on this. The economic aspects also indicate that this must be dealt with within NATO. I recommend that everyone take a look at the NATO treaty. Then you will see that Article 2 specifically addresses this economic aspect, which is connected to tariff increases. That means raising tariffs on European allies is a breach of the NATO treaty. So that's where the issue belongs, not in Davos or somewhere between the European Union and the Americans.
und den Amerikanern.
Aus den von Ihnen jetzt genannten Gründen gibt es
For the reasons you mentioned, many analysts conclude that the United States is not really concerned with Greenland's security, nor with NATO's security, but rather with territorial interests and the particular interests of the American president, with being the one who expands the United States as a nation. How do you see it?
Wie sehen Sie das?
Ja, da ist was dran. Sehen Sie, wir haben
Yes, there's something to that. You see, we're currently living in a world order of rival great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. Until now, this world order has been unipolar, meaning dominated by the United States. In fact, it's a world order that was created by the United States after World War II, and the dollar as the global reserve currency plays a very important role in it. For several years now, however, there has been a counter-movement toward a multipolar world, and it's been gaining strength. I see the higher security policy goal of the American government as preventing a truly multipolar world from emerging, and instead accepting the rivalry among the great powers.
Und eher zu akzeptieren die Rivalität der großen Mächte. Und dabei spielt eine große Rolle das Denken.
A major factor here is President Trump's way of thinking in terms of hemispheres. He views the American hemisphere, including Greenland and, so to speak, South America, as America's backyard. The Monroe Doctrine is being revived. Even Canada feels threatened. That's the hemisphere as he sees it. Europe plays no role in this, nor does NATO. But the crucial question is, does this mean he is also willing to grant the two rival great powers their own hemispheres, or not?
Eine eigene Hemisphäre zuzugestehen oder nicht? Das ist und für Europa und insbesondere
And for Europe, especially in relation to Russia, this question will be resolved when a peace agreement with Ukraine actually comes about. Then we will see whether he is ready for it. But I have the impression that he wants to continue normalizing relations between the United States and Russia. And also, his recent visit to China showed this. He wants to reduce the tensions that certainly exist, for example, over Taiwan. I take that as evidence that he actually wants to grant both of these great powers their own sphere of influence. But of course, I'm not sure. How can anyone be sure about the policies President Trump is pursuing?
Bei der Politik, die Präsident Trump verfolgt.
Nein. Nur wenn diese Interpretation
No, only if that interpretation is correct. Then the logical conclusion is that Europe, as the intermediary space in Russian-American relations, ultimately, just like Ukraine, would actually have to be neutralized as a buffer zone. That's what it would come down to.
Darauf würde es rauslaufen.
Absolut. Absolut.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've been saying for years that Europe must find the strength and the will to assert itself, politically, economically, technologically, and to some extent, militarily. That doesn't mean we should create an organization to rival NATO, but rather that we should strengthen the European pillar within NATO. Because the stronger we are ourselves, through our contribution to collective security, the greater our influence within NATO. After all, NATO's security policy brings together the security interests of all its member states.
Vereinigt ja die sicherheitspolitischen Interessen aller Bündnispartner. Sie ist ein Kompromiss. Und je mehr man dazu beiträgt,
It's a compromise, and the more one contributes, the greater the influence, of course. That's also where the United States derives, let me just say it plainly, its dominance within NATO, even though one must always keep in mind that only a small portion of U.S. defense spending actually goes to NATO. People always look at the total budget, but if you take a look at the world map and see where the Americans are engaged, it looks completely different.
Dann sieht das völlig anders aus.
Es sind natürlich gewiefte Hunde, zu sagen, dass das Gesamtbudget.
Of course, it's clever folks who claim that the overall budget counts toward NATO spending. But someone will have to explain to me how the US base over in Yokosuka contributes to the defense of Europe. Anyway, let's leave that aside. Mr. Kujat, if Donald Trump doesn't give up his claim to Greenland, and Greenland is, one way or another, incorporated into the United States, can NATO survive that?
Der USA einverleibt. Kann die NATO das überleben?
Das weiß ich nicht. Also ich spekuliere ungern.
I don't know. I don't like to speculate. What's certain is that this would be an enormous setback for NATO. And that's particularly serious because NATO hasn't played the role it should have over the past 15 years. It's lost focus. The war in Ukraine has played a major part in that. In a way, this defense alliance has run itself down. What we actually should have done, on the contrary, was to try to take advantage of the period of upheaval in the 1990s when the Soviet Union ceased to exist and the Warsaw Pact dissolved to strengthen the alliance. That didn't happen. We did the opposite.
Das ist nicht geschehen. Wir haben das Gegenteil gemacht. Wir haben im Grunde die Spannungen mit Russland nicht nur.
Basically, we have not only intensified the tensions with Russia, to put it cautiously, but indeed intensified them. And we have unfortunately suspended the good initiatives we adopted in the mid-1990s, as I mentioned the NATO-Russia Founding Act. So the answer to your question is actually a different one. The answer to your question is, Europe must make a current active contribution to ending this war. Europe must, as quickly as possible, create a European security and peace order that includes both Russia and Ukraine. After all these years, Europe must become a factor of geopolitical stability, and that, of course, also means that we must make efforts to strengthen our defense capabilities.
Unsere Verteidigungsfähigkeit zu erhöhen. Aber es bedeutet nicht,
But that doesn't mean we're separating ourselves from the United States. That's a very, very important point. And when I hear that discussions are resurfacing about nuclear armament for Germany, I can only say that's the craziest thing being discussed right now. Completely absurd and contrary to our national security interests. So we must work together, and I'll use that word again, together, to strengthen our self-assertion. Europe has slipped into geopolitical insignificance, not only because of the war in Ukraine, but also because of our tense relationship with China.
In die Bedeutungslosigkeit abgerutscht. Und das ist eben auch ein Faktor, der im Verhältnis.
And that is also a factor that plays a role in the relationship between the American government and Europe. When you discredit yourself to such an extent, you become a pawn of the kinds of interests we are currently witnessing, Greenland and many other things. No, we must become an adequate, mature ally, I deliberately do not say partner, of the United States, one that is recognized, respected, and taken seriously. Only in this way can we assert our European and national security interests, not only vis-à-vis Russia and China, but also vis-à-vis the United States.
Nicht nur gegenüber China, sondern auch gegenüber den Vereinigten Staaten durchsetzen.
Wer müsste das tun?
Who would have to do that? Would the EU have to take it on? Or would Berlin, Paris and London need to sit down together?
Zusammensitzen? Wer müsste das übernehmen?
Also wir müssen das muss.
Who would have to take that on? It has to happen within NATO. The European Union is completely unsuitable for that. I wouldn't even want to mention the European Union in this context. I don't want to go into more detail now, but it has to happen within NATO. And of course, the major European countries have to take the lead. I would actually name, by the way, the United Kingdom isn't even in the European Union, so the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy. Those, I would say, are the 4 countries. Maybe also Poland, that would be even better. You see, NATO itself is under a great deal of strain. When you look at NATO's policy toward Ukraine, you see this coalition of the willing, that's what I called it. But then you also have countries that pursue a completely different policy, such as Hungary, Slovakia, or the Czech Republic, for example. Then there are the southern European countries, which see risks to their own security coming from a completely different direction. So the key issue is keeping NATO together. That's the crucial point. And on that front, the last 3 NATO Secretaries General have failed. But the major countries, including Germany, have also pursued a NATO policy that was not appropriate to the size and economic strength of our country. And we did that because we ourselves eliminated the conditions for it by making the Bundeswehr, through the 2011 reform, essentially incapable of national and alliance defense as required by our Constitution, and instead designed only for foreign missions. And now we're trying to correct that mistake, but such things take a very, very long time. I want to emphasize this again. We used to say that the strength of the Bundeswehr and our influence in NATO are 2 sides of the same coin. And for many years since 2011, one side of that coin was practically non-existent. So we have to take action. That's very important. We don't need a perception of threat for that. We simply have to do what the Constitution requires. That's completely sufficient. The Constitution says the federal government establishes armed forces for defense, period. So they must also be capable of doing that. That's the crucial point. But these states are. Then we too can represent our interests with our heads held high toward those 3 great powers, Russia, China, and the United States, with our heads held high and not fall into this timid submissiveness like we're seeing right now, holding talks on the sidelines of a conference about existential questions for our continent, about the survival of this very important defense organization, NATO. That's completely inappropriate. Completely inappropriate.
Das ist halt das Problem, wenn man davon ausgeht, dass
That's the problem when you assume that the only thing capable of providing security on the continent is the US nuclear arsenal. If you're not aware that there are other ways to create security, for example, through joint structures, exchange, and
Genau. Das ist genau der Punkt.
Exactly. That's precisely the point. That's this one-dimensional way of thinking. You see, we can go back to 1967, to the Harald report, which said NATO's policy is to be capable of defense while at the same time pursuing détente. That's the crucial point. It still applies today, just as important as it was back then, in 1967. And people should also remember what this 2-track, this dual policy achieved. In the end, it led to Germany's reunification.
Sie hat letztlich zur Wiedervereinigung Deutschlands geführt.
Ja.
And for the reunification of Germany, the consent of the Soviet Union, ultimately Russia, was needed. And they gave it. They trusted that it would turn out well.
Dass das gut kommen wird.
Genau, und sie haben das gegeben, weil sie eben
Exactly. And they gave that support because they realized this dual policy, defense capability and détente, was actually being pursued. Those weren't just words. That was politics as it's practically done. That's how we did it. And I wonder, if you had to describe NATO's security policy today in one sentence, what would it look like? You'd have a hard time. In any case, that dimension, that magnitude that was brought in back then, geopolitically, and perhaps primarily in terms of European policy, you don't find that today.
Die finden Sie heute nicht.
Ich verzweifle ein bisschen daran, dass Leute, die nur
I'm a bit frustrated that people who think only in terms of deterrence, and there are many of them, completely forget that there's no better security than when no one wants to attack you. Without enemies, you have security. Unfortunately, today's thinking is really focused on deterrence, and only on deterrence. And that completely ignores the other component. It's really been blanked out, gone.
Also wirklich ausgeblendet, weg.
Ich bin ja mein Mentor war ja Helmut Schmidt. Und ich vertrete nach wie vor
My mentor was Helmut Schmidt, and I still stand by his strategic approach. That is the approach of the balance of power. We must be able to defend ourselves. That's important. But, and this is an important prerequisite for peace as well, a necessary one, but not a sufficient one, as he said. This balance of power must be politically stabilized by talking with the other side, understanding their interests, their goals, and their capabilities, political, military, and industrial, and by contributing through disarmament and arms control, through military confidence-building measures, to the creation of a situation he called predictability of political action.
Des politischen Handelns entsteht. Und das ist im Grunde genommen, wenn ich jetzt mal als Militär
And that is basically, if I may speak as a military person, that's exactly what we need in a military situation assessment. There's our own situation and there's the enemy's situation, and you have to know both precisely in order to reach the right conclusion. It's really that simple. Every lieutenant learns that, but politicians just don't.
Politiker lernen das eben.
Darum muss man ja auch
That's why it's important to understand what the other side can do, does, wants, and actually does, and not just rely on interpretations of how one would like to see the case.
gerne sehen möchte.
Ja, genau. Gut, wir müssen wegkommen, das will ich auch noch. Wir müssen
Yes,
aktiver werden in
exactly.
unserer Politik.
We need to move away from that. We also need to become more active in our politics. When I hear politicians say, we want to, we will, we intend to, and so on, I always say, all right, but can't you also say we have done this has happened, we have achieved that? More things like that. Basically, how should I put it? In the end, it's also a question of competence, and you can see that very clearly in this dispute over Greenland. There's a real lack of competence.
Im Grönland. Es fehlt auch wirklich an Kompetenz. Deshalb wiederhole ich nochmal, wer sich wirklich dafür interessiert.
That's why I'll repeat once more. Anyone who is truly interested should take a look at the agreement between Denmark and the United States, at least at the updated agreement from 2004. And they should also read Article 2 of the NATO Treaty. Then they might understand that the place for decision-making, the place for balancing interests among allies, must be within, not outside of, the organizations and mechanisms we already have. And that is NATO. We have a military committee that can assess matters neutrally, militarily, and strategically, and can make its judgment available to the NATO Council. And there, the heads of state and government can genuinely try to find a solution that is acceptable to the United States, as well as tolerable for Denmark and Greenland.
Als auch für Dänemark und für Grönland hinnehmbar.
Wenn eine Lösung denn da
If a solution is what's being sought,
wir werden sehen,
but we'll see what comes of it.
die nächsten
The next few weeks will be decisive. General Kujat, thank you very much for your time today.
Dank für Ihre Zeit heute.
Thank you. All the best.